So I'm starting again. Those of you who just heard this, put up with it. We are, in fact, this is your day of technical difficulties, Lucy. This is what I promised they would happen. They are, in fact, happening. Welcome. My name is Peter Loge. The director of the Project on Ethics and Political Communication here at the George Washington University. As a reminder, this is being recorded. I am recording this. I'll post a link to the recording on the Project on Ethics and Political Communications website in the next day or two. I'll email around the link to everybody who registered. It will be here forever, or as long as the internet lasts, whichever comes first. Before we get to today's conversation, I want to remind everybody who we are and what we do. We are the Project on Ethics and Political Communication, which I launched in 2019 to promote the study, teaching, and practice of political communication ethics. You hate to say now more than ever, but feels a little now more than ever. Here in the project, we do things like host conversations like this, write occasional classroom-ready case studies with the University of Texas Austin's Media Ethics Center, talk to the press, write things for the political and popular press, write academic articles, speak at conventions, just trying to make noise about the importance of ethics and political communication. Pleased to be joined today by Lucy Caldwell. I'm going to read part of her bio from my phone when she approved. So Lucy, if it's wrong, it's not my fault. Lucy Caldwell is a political strategist and technology executive who's devoted her career to fighting U.S. authoritarianism. Early in her career was a Republican working for, among other things, at the Goldwater Institute in Phoenix, has been a technology executive, award-winning technology executive, was the campaign manager to former Tea Party Congressman turned never-Trumper Joe Walsh and his insurgent primary challenge to Donald Trump. Has done a number of things, has appeared on MSNBC, CNN, Fox, NPR This Morning, on C-SPAN, graduate of Harvard College, is on the advisory board of Gary Kasparov's Renew Democracy Initiative. I'm a huge chess guy, so in addition to the democracy piece, I think that's super cool. And a founding advisor to the Atoll Society. And I should note, we talk about politics being a small town. It turns out, actually, politics is a small neighborhood in Phoenix. Lucy grew up with the daughter of my first boss in Congress and lived around the corner from Sam Coppersmith and also Andy Gordon, who was Sam's chief of staff. And Andy grew up with my dad and my uncles in Redlands, California. So really, Arizona, or politics isn't just a small town. Politics is a small neighborhood in Phoenix. With that, Lucy, thank you. Thanks for joining us, fresh on the heels of what I heard you killed it on C-SPAN this morning.
Well, thank you. That was just the warm up. Thanks for having me.
Just the warm up. Audio dropped, I understand, this morning in C-SPAN, and the video dropped at the beginning of this one. So I feel like we're just trying to keep up with Sam Feist and his new.
I'm the problem. I'm the problem. It is I. I'm the common denominator.
So thanks everybody for joining us. I think we've had a great session today. I think we can end on that note. We've talked about a lot of stuff, and we're going to get to a lot of your experience and why you're doing what you're doing. But I want to start the conversation talking about the media ecosystem and how the left and the right go. When we did a prep call and also just now, you're making the case that conservatives are actually much more open to internal debate than liberals. And you saw that manifest with a couple of media sessions that conservatives and liberals had here in DC. Talk about your thinking here.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I think the most recent contrast point that I saw in recent days, including over the weekend, was the contrast between the reaction on the left to some of what had been said at the Crooked Media convention over the weekend versus the way that the right interacts in fora like Megyn Kelly's, whatever it was that she hosted last week, Megyn Kelly Festival of sorts. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But I have a weird background, and I've taken a sort of circuitous route in that, unlike most people, I have worked pretty deeply on both the Republican side and on the Democratic side. And so something that I know I have a bit more, or at least a strange viewpoint on, but sort of earned from those years, is being able to really truly say whether or not each side is analogous to each other. And they really are are not, right? I think that right now on the left, a lot of my Democratic colleagues now are trying to figure out how to solve their media ecosystem problem. And there's a sense that the left just needs to find its own Joe Rogan. But the point is that I would make the point that the very premise of that idea doesn't acknowledge how it is that the right-wing media ecosystem came to be so strong. And I would say that in that information landscape, the right really is winning. They have a very diverse media ecosystem. And I think a thing that would surprise a lot of people who are not like in it all day long, every day, is that if you're a person who has like my politics, or probably the politics of many people on this call, and you think that a lot of what's happening right now on the right with MAGA, with Donald Trump, is very frightening and feels very authoritarian, you think, oh my God, Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, doesn't even make a show of trying to do anything other than exactly what Donald Trump tells him to do. This party is a cult, and there's no diversity of opinion, there's no sort of room to dissent. But then you look at actually the right-wing media ecosystem, and on display just a few days ago, the Megyn Kelly affair, and they're actually all fighting with each other all the time. And that's actually, I would say, a feature, not a bug, right? And it creates all of these entry points for being part of the right wing, part of the MAGA tent, where you actually can hold a lot of different viewpoints, right? In ways that are very different from the left. So on the Republican side, I think there's this sense of like letting all flowers bloom, these independent creators, independent media folks who think of themselves as, an antidote to the sort of so-called left-wing legacy media, who are pushing a range of views. And then on the left, you have a situation where it is in fact quite top down. So the Democratic Party is not going to find its Joe Rogan, because a search for Joe Rogan of the left would in and of itself be out of keeping with the sort of style of how a Joe Rogan comes to be, right? And you could see that at the Crooked Con over the weekend, when some members of Congress, including, speaking of Arizona, Senator Ruben Gallego, were being interviewed and dared to say that actually infrastructure in the Biden era of not so long ago had been extremely hard to sell, and that it had been challenging as a lawmaker to communicate back to the Biden administration that this is not sexy, this is not an easy or compelling thing to sell to voters in an election year. And even that comment now, said in 2025, long after, right, we're out of that cycle, was immediately met with backlash online. So I'll pause there, but sort of to your point about what do I mean, that's what I mean by that.
So I think certainly liberal and conservative outrage has become a feature, not a bug, of
Yes.
the ecosystems, because that's how you get clicks and that's how you get attention, right? We're certainly
Yeah.
seeing that in response to a relative handful of Democratic senators, for example, voting to end the government shutdown. But let's talk though. I want to talk about how that translates into actual policy and then the ethics of that. The first piece is how it translates into policy. I don't pay a lot of attention to the conservative media system, but in my defense, I pay a lot of attention to the liberal media system either. I find them both sort of uninteresting. But Republicans do tend to vote entirely down the line with Donald Trump, or they get pilloried at the polls. So you might be able to say what you want, but you can't do what you want. And there's a long list of candidates or would-be candidates from former elected officials whose conservative credentials are beyond question, and who have spoken up against the president and for a vision of conservatism that might be more traditional and more familiar, for example, to Arizonans, who then got thumped at the polls. So you can say what you want, but you can't do what you want. That's both on the Democratic side. Democrats elected both moderate governors and a very liberal mayor on the same day. So is it the noise that matters, or is it the actual voting and the stuff that happens that matter?
Well, I do think it is the noise that matters because I think that I think both matter. I do think the noise that matters because actually that noise is part of what is driving voter behavior. And I think just because there does not seem to be a moderating factor within the right-wing media ecosystem, does not mean that there's not a diversity of views. There's just a diversity of crazy views, of just crazy
I
views.
I don't know. I think Representative Cheney was a principled conservative, and she got chased out of the party because
Oh,
she.
you will not. I mean, I'm an ex-Republican. You will not find disagreement from me on that at all, right? And I mean, I think that takes us into, the obviously the need for structural reform, primary reform. I mean, the it is true that by and large, I mean, in general, and I've done a lot of work in the independent ecosystem around structural reform. I mean, something like some unbelievable number of races in this country are actually decided by like 10% of voters, right? Because once the primaries are over, the fix is in, so to speak, right? And you may not even live in a state where you have the ability to cross into another primary if you're an independent, right? So you might actually truly be disenfranchised. I think that to me is overlapping but discrete from the media ecosystem question. Does that make sense?
I think so. I think so. So let's talk about that, because you've got the political theater. You and I
Mm-hmm.
are involved in. I teach it, and you and I were both
Mm-hmm.
part of it. Um, you've also, and that has its own economic logic, right? You want to tune into the exciting, you want to watching pro wrestling is way more exciting than watching college wrestling for many people. Right? If you're into Olympic wrestling, that's very cool, but the spectacle of pro wrestling gets the
Mm-hmm.
ratings. And so it's a spectacle of politics that gets the ratings. The other thing that happens then is you and I can say it should be better. People should be less shouty online. The ecosystem should be more honest. Elected officials should behave more responsibly, use their inside voice more, find common solutions to shared problems, blah, blah, blah. But as you point out, that's not how our elections are structured. Our elections are structured in a way that because of gerrymandering, it's the extremes that win the primaries, and therefore the general's a foregone conclusion. You've got single member districts, you've got campaign finance. So we can talk about whatever we want, but unless the structures begin to reward that behavior, we're stuck in awful eco-media systems, awful shoutiness, and a universe in which government operating becomes the norm, and government shutdowns, or government operating becomes the outlier, and government shutdowns become the norm.
Well, and not to make people feel full of despair about just how deep, how systemic these issues are, there are even aspects of, you mentioned campaign finance, aspects of our current environment that ostensibly seem like they should be really good and should create a more responsive environment that in fact have a pretty dark side. So for example, small dollar donations, I would not say that's been such a net positive for democracy, even though arguably we should love it, right? Because we should love the idea of the little guy. When I started out in politics, the stats around what percentage of Americans donated ever to a campaign was like, well under 1%. And now it's actually quite a bit higher than that. And that has happened in the last 15 years. And what has come along with it, right? Not more responsive politicians, right? There's a direct line from being shouty and not bipartisan, not willing to work across the aisle, not being reasonable, just being not exactly what we would call sort of like statesman-like, to raising money online, and raising money online from people who may not be in your district. And then there's a different pipeline of the political consultant class who now have cottage industries of just, like running candidates in districts that they're never going to win in, right? Because they can spin up strong, low dollar fundraising from people who are just like in that vortex of sort of small dollar donation, shoutiness, and so on and so forth. So,
Yeah, I mean, actually, that I think Tim Miller makes that point very well. Tim is a graduate of the School of Media and Public Affairs, an alum of our program, has spoken to my classes here, and he makes a pretty compelling case that online small dollar donors, he just says, sounded like a great idea until suddenly it wasn't. And you also your point about the consultant class, I think, is also an important one. There's a guy named Robert Rabin who's a liberal strategist here in DC, runs a group called the Rabin Group. And he described the Democratic National Committee as a trade association for consultants and incumbents, which was as good a description of the DNC as I've heard. And I say this as somebody who spent a career in Democratic politics. So what do we do about it? You got a couple of minutes. Can you solve it?
it's very complicated. It's very complicated.
And you're very
Um,
smart, so let's go.
I mean, I think that there are some real big reforms that would make a difference. I think structural reforms do have a positive effect. Things like, I'm actually not that hot on ranked choice voting, but I think ranked choice voting is a bit overblown. I like it, like I'll take it, but I think that RCV is not exactly the panacea everyone says it is. Um, if there are any RCV advocates listening to this, I'm sure I'll get hate mail because there's like a religiosity in the structural reform crowd among like, are you a final five? Are you star voting? Whatever. I think nonpartisan primaries is one of the most compelling reforms. Um, its detractors have done a good job of dubbing it jungle primaries, to the point that that is a phrase that makes sense to a lot of people that they know. But I think we can even look at places where that is being rolled back and see how good it was. So I mean, look at Louisiana, look at Senator Bill Cassidy, who was one of the lone votes in favor of impeachment in the second impeachment, who in part was able to take, actually, when you look at those senators, Romney, Collins, Cassidy, and others who voted to impeach Donald Trump, they were all either like sort of Mitt Romney and termed out, or in places where there was structural reform, right? Like Murkowski in Alaska, Collins. I think structural reform really does allow politicians to seek their better angels. Um, So that is one thing. And in Louisiana, that's why I started with the Cassidy example, they are actually rolling back that reform. And you can actually see it in Cassidy's behavior now, that he is now having to behave quite differently because he has a Republican primary to get through now that is going to look quite different. I also think, and this is a very bold reform, and it would take a lot to get there, I think multi-member districts is interesting. I think in general, it's kind of crazy that we only have 435 members of Congress and that it hasn't kept up um, with where we would have expected that number to grow based on being a country of 300 million people. And yeah, 435 seems like a lot, but wouldn't it be good if we being in Congress wasn't like being a celebrity, and it wasn't just like trying to get on cable and raising money online for your, if you had many more members of Congress, it's not, again, none of these things are panaceas, right? But you wouldn't have a consultant class behaving in quite that way, right? And people would have to have different incentives if they've had to spend more time in their district, or be more responsive. We were at my childhood neighborhood, right? Like having a member of Congress for that, like 100-block radius instead of these crazy maps. And I know, of course, that the media piece is an essential, it's interconnected and an essential piece of this. You and I last week talked a little bit about things like, how do you properly incentivize local media? How do you, balance that changing ecosystem in a way that is responsive.
So much to unpack there, and absolutely on local media. Study after study finds that in areas where there's a robust local media, politics tends to be less shouty, less crazy, and also more local. More gets done. There's less corruption. City council members are more honest because they're being held to account. Local campaigns are about local issues because there are local media holding them accountable. Political consultants and candidates behave their incentives. They'd rather run on local issues. If there is no local media, the only news people are consuming is about foreign policy. City council member is going to run foreign policy because the only thing people are talking about. If you're in a place where there is local media, pay for it. If you do not put your money where your mouth is, reporters will not be able to do their jobs. Pay for local media. I subscribe to several local media outlets in places I don't live, and I may never go because friends are running them and they're important. I want to come back to Cassidy real briefly, though. So I think Cassidy is actually an example of the media ecosystems we were talking about before, and you can say what you want, but you can't do what you want. Senator Cassidy is a principled conservative. He's taken some politically difficult votes on guns, for example. He's really good on public health. You may not disagree with him, but he's a super smart guy on it. He's got a terrific team, but he might get primaried because he voted the wrong way. So I'm not sure that, I think the big tent might work online, but when it comes to actual elections, it seems there's much more focus on purity on the right than on the left. And Cassidy, I think, is an example of that.
Well, right. I mean, my point about Cassidy was that in the previous electoral environment in Louisiana, he was that electoral system of not having to go through a traditional Republican primary created a buffer for him to
Right. So the incentives allow it, right?
to
So the incentives on the right for the media system encourage shouting at each other and rough and tumble because people want to tune into that. That's exciting to watch. The incentives for elections are do what Trump says or don't at your own peril. You're on the bus or you're under the bus. On the political left, maybe it's the opposite. Maybe it's you have to say the right things. In the crooked media universe, for those who don't pay mind-numbingly close attention to it, is Pod Save America and that whole crew. But when it comes to voting, you've got a bit more leeway. Senator Warner might disagree with that. He's being taken off some Christmas card lists as we speak as a result. But it is this example of us behaving the incentives, which brings me back to two of your examples. One is the House being too small. Those of you who've been to the House of Representatives know that it physically is very small. I think one reason there are 435 members of the House is because there's really nowhere to put anybody else. And the office.
we have Trump's ballroom now, Peter. We can put them in the ballroom. No, I'm just kidding. Keep going.
The Ford building of
Yes,
the U.S. House of Representatives. I mean, it's so crowded that staff now have offices in what used to be cages in the attic of the Cannon building, in which they used to store interns. I'm not actually making that up, and which now store staff. So the multi-member districts is also Danielle Allen, the Harvard philosopher and political theorist, is really big on pushing the size of the House. Now, multi-member districts is also something that's come up a lot actually on with these conversations. Now, how do we make it happen? I mean, these are all terrific ideas. Even like no one is like the magic thing to get it done. But how do we actually go from where we are to the structures that create the system that we want?
If I were channeling Larry Lessig right now, I would say Article 5 convention, of course. No, I mean, that's the challenge that in some, and that does scare people, right? And I'm not a John Bircher. But that is the challenge because in some cases, um, it's hard to even know what the mechanics of these things would be. And there's also this prisoner's dilemma issue, and we've seen this a lot in areas like efforts at electoral college reform, right? One idea would be, okay, push the national popular vote through through constitutional amendment, but then there's sort of like a back doorway, which is you just get every state to change how it allocates its electoral votes, and you do like what Nebraska and Maine do, but then you're constantly in this whack-a-mole project where okay, well, you in either scenario, right? And I actually, in a different lifetime, was involved in some of the Article 5 convention and amending the Constitution around federal violence budget amendment work. So in either case, you are constantly um, herding kittens because you make inroads here and then you stop watching that and then they roll it back. I do think this is sounds like a kind of empty answer, but it's really not. I think that massive, massive public awareness campaigns on this stuff is the way. It's probably someone running for president and or in some massive national campaign as a single issue campaigner on this stuff to get attention and to just sort of like keep hammering on some of these reforms until there's a moment.
I mean, the good news is there are all the good people doing a lot of good work around this. There's what the former Congressman Derek Kilmer calls the reform industrial complex, but there are efforts around primary systems and ranked choice voting, and Louisiana might be rolling it back, but California's had it for a while and said mixed results. But people are doing stuff. So hopefully in that moment. In the remaining moments, so I do want to touch on one last topic that came up when people RSVP'd and threw questions in their note, and that's political violence. It's been on the minds of a lot of people. We did a session on it right after the murder of Charlie Kirk. The two questions are: is it equivalent on the left and on the right? How real is it, and how do we stop it?
No, I don't think they're equivalent. I think it is on the rise on the left, but I think if people need to are looking for resources, if it feels to you like these aren't equivalent, but where is the data to back up that it isn't equivalent? It doesn't feel equivalent to me. Look no further than the Cato Institute, which maybe is not in the good graces of Republicans today, but is no liberal outfit, right? And the Cato Institute has done really interesting and objective work around where political violence stems from, and just sort of going through year by year. It is absolutely worse on the right. I do feel like anecdotally, I see more, not more than, but more unacceptable, ugly forms of speech on the left than I previously did. Much more open language that is obviously anti-Semitic, otherwise, unacceptable in other ways on the left relative to other moments in the recent past. So I'm certainly not. I'm not an apologist for the left or suggesting that the left is perfect and pure. But I do think that the political violence problem is primarily on the right. And of course, all of this is a fraction. Most Republicans, the vast majority of Republicans, don't want political violence. But when you have a person in the White House who often uses language that anyone objective would say could very easily incite violence, it's not surprising that that's the ecosystem we find ourselves in.
Tucker Carlson just interviewed somebody who was a fan of Stalin, for example.
Mm.
All right. On that happy note, it turns out it could get more depressing, but at least there are no more audio challenges. We're at our 30 minutes as promised. Thank you all for tuning in, or whatever the right verb is, for showing up to a webinar that's going to live online. Thank you, Lucy. When you go home, please say hi to anybody you see who I know, like my old boss or my old chief of staff, for example. And we look forward to continue the conversations.
Thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
Good night. See you, everybody. See you soon.